But tonight, we're going to talk and commemorate the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb by talking about the bombing of Japan, the entire campaign that obviously was punctuated at the end with the dropping of the first A-bombs. Well, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The following 6 months, they ran wild across the Pacific. They carved out a huge new imperial empire for the Japanese, throwing out the British, the Americans, the Dutch, and creating what they thought would be a fortress that would be difficult for the Americans to reconquer. And the Japanese people, for not just those 6 months, but throughout the war, were fed outrageous propaganda of the unending victories of the Japanese, even though the Japanese empire began to shrink. Tonight, we'll take a look at how the bombing of the homeland started when Curtis LeMay took command that changed the nature of the bombing, how Japan prepared for the actual invasion of the mainland, our plans to invade, and then the background of the development of the atomic bomb itself. Then we'll zero in on the emperor and his cabinet and the attempt by members of the Japanese military to have a coup to capture the emperor and stop the surrender. Then the surrender itself, we'll talk about the rebirth and remembrance of modern Japan, and then finally we'll talk about the use of the atomic bomb. So we see here on this slide the offensive that the United States started first at Guadalcanal and working its way throughout the Pacific. After the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway, much of their naval air power was destroyed. And without that, the Japanese had increasing difficulties in defending this huge area of the Pacific. Now remember, though, most of their army actually was tied up in China. They had invaded China in 1931, and millions of their troops remained in China throughout the entire war. You will see the Mariana Islands, which were conquered in August and June of 1944. This includes the islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. This is 1,500 miles from the homeland itself, but it was within bombing range of the new bombers the Americans had developed. And here you see the air routes that those bombers would take from those islands. There were 6 airfields built to accommodate hundreds of the brand new B-29 bombers, which was a revolutionary bomber, the largest one built in the Second World War. The plane itself was almost 100 feet long, 27 feet high, and it had a wingspan of 141 feet. It had 12 machine guns. It flew at 38,000 feet at a very high speed of 350 miles an hour and could fly 3,500 miles with over 4 tons of bombs. It was the plane that made the bombing of Japan possible. In November and December, the first bombing started at high altitude and pinpoint aerial bombing. The problem was at that high altitude, the bombs were very inaccurate because wind could move them off target. And the bombing itself was largely ineffective and caused very little damage to the Japanese. As a result of this, in early 1945, General Curtis LeMay took command of the bombing campaign. He had been critical to the success of bombing in Europe, in Germany and throughout Europe, and he thought that he would use new tactics in order to succeed, and he did. He switched to low-level bombing rather than high-altitude bombing, and he used wide area bombing rather than pinpoint bombing, using a new incendiary bomb. Well, why did he do this? Well, here's modern Tokyo, but this is very deceptive because this is the part of Tokyo that looks more like a Western city. Most of Tokyo itself, many of the buildings were made of paper and wood, and therefore they were highly inflammable and very combustible. On January 9th, 1945, the first major air attack occurred on Tokyo. The B-29s released 609,000 pounds of napalm bombs in its first hour at altitudes of 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Now, the night of the 9th and 10th of March in 1945 was the most violent night of the entire Second World War. More people died in this bombing than at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. 130,000 Japanese died and 1,000 more were killed in this first raid. About 15 square miles of Tokyo itself was totally obliterated in the firestorm. 14 B-29s were lost and 140 airmen, U.S. airmen, were killed. Now, more raids occurred of Tokyo in April and May of 1945, and an additional over 11 square miles of the city were totally destroyed. By August of 1945, 1 million of the 1.65 million buildings in Tokyo had been wiped out, about 250 square miles. So from March to August of 1945, 64 additional Japanese cities were torched using firebombs. This included Kobe, Osaka, and Yokohama. The 67 cities in total were basically destroyed. 180 square miles of urban Japan were wiped out. By July of 45, half of Tokyo had been burned to the ground. 300,000 Japanese civilians died in these air raids. 20% of the housing of Japan was destroyed. 15 million Japanese were made homeless. Well, what was the response by the Japanese military? They had developed this new Tony fighter with a speed of 366 miles per hour and a ceiling of 33,000 feet. It was a big improvement to the Zero, but it was no match against the US P-51 Mustang escorts that escorted the bombers. The Tony, the Mustang, had a speed of 445 miles per hour and could go higher, up to almost 42,000 feet. In desperation, the Tony airplanes, pictured here in this slide, started ramming the bombers. The last ramming occurred in June 26, 1945. Now, the question is asked many times, well, why was Tokyo so vulnerable to this massive devastation? Well, the truth is, what occurred here was similar to the raids in Hamburg and later in Dresden, Germany. Of course, as I said, the buildings are made largely of paper and wood, but in many cases, the atmospherics were right. They were dry, and the atmosphere was very dry at the time, and there were significant winds that would cause a firestorm. The Japanese called this an akakaze, the red wind, that swept with a hurricane force through these cities. It drove up temperatures to up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, creating superheated vapors that advanced ahead of the flames, killing and incapacitating everyone. The mechanisms of death were multiple: oxygen deficiency, carbon monoxide poisoning, radiant heat, direct flames, and of course, the trampling feet of stampeding crowds of people trying to escape. So the causes of death were in many cases later to ascertain. Japan was left in utter ruins. Here are the results of these major cities that had been largely wiped out. The reason this was effective in many ways is because the aerial defenses of the Japanese were inadequate. Their planes were inferior and too few. They had too few anti-aircraft guns. The air raid shelters were inferior and not enough of them. And their fire equipment was antiquated, and again, there wasn't enough fire equipment. On the American side, 136 B-29s were lost during these raids. They were shot down. However, 30,000 Air Force personnel were rescued. Here's a picture of a B-29 crash landing on Iwo Jima. Before the main islands were invaded, Iwo Jima, which is considered part of metropolitan Japan, had been taken at horrendous cost by the U.S. Marines and Army. Airfields were built so that if the planes couldn't make it back to their bases, they could crash land on land or around that area. So 30,000 airmen were rescued by Iwo, which was like a large lifeboat. In July of 1945, U.S. planes began blanketing the few remaining Japanese cities, warning of the firebombing, and made an appeal to the people. It read, "As you know, America now stands for humanity. It does not wish to injure innocent people, so you had better evacuate your cities." Some did, most did not. Between January and July of 1945, the U.S. firebombed and destroyed all but 5 Japanese cities deliberately. They spared Kyoto, the ancient capital, and 4 other cities. Well, what was the result of this? Did Japan consider surrender? No surrender. The Japanese had never lost a war. They were not going to lose face, and they were prepared to fight to the bitter end. Here is Prime Minister Tojo, who had started the war in his cabinet. He had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were forced out in July of 1944 after the U.S. took Saipan. Here's the cabinet that replaced the government. Some in this cabinet did want peace, but most still wanted to continue the war. The chief obstacle to an early Japanese surrender was our demand for unconditional surrender. And the imperial system would continue after their surrender. We refused to give it. They feared that the emperor might be put up as a war criminal, and this fear made the Japanese fight even harder, hoping that high U.S. casualties, as we had experienced on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Okinawa with the beginning of the kamikazes smashing into over 300 ships, the U.S. experienced the greatest number of casualties in our Navy during the entire Second World War. They had hoped that this would force the United States to give them better terms. So the Japanese prepared for the invasion of the home islands. They called it Operation Ketsu-Go, Decisive Battle. How did they prepare? Well, here were the military forces on the main islands, 2.3 million regular military, 4 million additional, 6 million armed soldiers. The Air Force of 10,000 kamikaze aircraft and 3,000 conventional aircraft, with enough gasoline and bombs for the invasion. The Navy had concealed, let's just go back to this for just a moment. The Air Force had concealed 200 takeoff strips and 70 airfields and 24 plane bases that were hidden that they would use to attack the invasion. The Navy had 19 destroyers, 5,000 suicide craft. They had floating bombs deployed from 98 secret bases. They had saved food, and they planned to release the prison guards for frontline duty. Upon the beginning of the invasion, all the prisoners of war they had brought to Japan as slave labor would be killed. Extensive use was to be made of biological warfare. In Manchuria, they had built a plant that would kill had material that would kill half of the people on Earth at that time. They had 100,000 tons of biological weapons. The Japanese had succeeded in sending to the United States hot air balloons to start and incinerate fires right where you're at in the Pacific Northwest. The United States deployed an entire parachute battalion of infantry to fight about 300 confirmed fires in the Pacific Northwest. One of the fires landed near one of the atomic bomb plants, and if it had reached that plant, a major explosion. What you may not know, and what's only been revealed recently, is the Japanese also sent thousands of balloons with live botulism poisoning through the jet stream to hit the Pacific Northwest and the rest of the United States to release a form of bubonic plague. Luckily for the United States, those balloons flew at such a high altitude that the botulisms were frozen and therefore remained rendered inert. So when they landed, they were useless. Nothing happened. We were very lucky. The invasion beaches that the Japanese thought the Americans would use had interlocking fire-controlled air and sea observation, and there were poison gas pipes buried under all the principal landing sites to gas our troops when we landed. The Allied invasion would be met by a whirlwind Japanese counterattack. Hourly waves of 300 to 400 kamikaze aircraft would hit the fleets. The goal was to sink 15 to 30% of the 5,000 ships in the invasion fleet. Also, those suicide naval craft were also going to be used to crash into the ships. Inland, critical hill networks of tunnels, deep underground rooms, command posts, food, ammo storage, and freshwater wells were dug, like on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, but even more extensively. The Japanese defense goal was ferocious counterattacks aimed at killing soldiers to make the cost in blood so high that the Allies would seek a negotiated armistice. Japanese goal was simple: fight to the last ditch. Then, in that last ditch, 2 million civilians had been armed with 81,000 rifles, 120,000 bayonets, pipe guns, crossbows, bazookas, and automatic weapons. By the summer of 1945, Emperor Hirohito wanted peace. Why? First, the cities had been destroyed. Second, the civilians were starving. The United States had sunk the Japanese merchant marine with our submarines, largely, and Japan, of course, relied on the importation of food and fuel in order to sustain itself. Third, also, there was a tremendous loss of faith in the military by the emperor and by the Japanese people. Later, the atomic bomb blasts convinced Hirohito to end. And finally, there was a fear of a civilian uprising over the rapidly deteriorating conditions because of the very severe food rationing. As you can see here, here's some of the people lining up for the meager supplies of food. However, the Japanese military persisted. Here is a picture of children digging out uranium in Japan. The Japanese were trying to develop their own atomic bomb. Most of the children pictured here died of uranium poisoning. Well, what were the plans for the United States to invade the mainland? It was called Operation Downfall. The blueprint was to force the unconditional surrender of Japan, first by establishing sea and air blockades, intensive air bombardment, and destroying the Japanese Navy and air strength. Then invading the islands. First, in Kyushu must be taken, then Honshu, particularly the Tokyo plain, would be overrun. The date for the invasion of Kyushu, codenamed Olympic, was November 1st, 1945. The main beaches were chosen and 650,000 U.S. ground troops would invade. General Kruger's Sixth Army, spearheaded by the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Marine Divisions, plus the 1st Cavalry Division, would land in the midst of concentrated fire from the well-entrenched Japanese defenses. The bloodshed was expected to be enormous. This would be followed by Operation Coronet in March of 1946 to invade the island of Honshu. Many expected that this war would continue into 46, possibly into 1947. Many of the naval planners suspected that the conquest of these islands would be bloody beyond comparison. It would make the Normandy invasion look like a kindergarten exercise. The Japanese expected, of course, that somewhere during this time period, the U.S. would reconsider its conditions for surrender. Here were the predicted casualties. On the Allied side, a horrendous number killed. And of course, all of the Allied POWs were to be killed by the Japanese when the invasion started. And with the Japanese, basically, the island of Japan would be destroyed. Its population would basically be annihilated. U.S. Chief of Staff General Marshall warned that war weariness in the United States may demand the return home of those men who had fought so long in war in the European War. And it would affect the prosecution of the Japanese invasion. Some military wondered whether there was some other way to induce surrender before the invasion. Well, let's talk now about the atomic bomb. Here's a picture of Fat Man, one of the 2 bombs. In October of 1939, the world-renowned scientist Albert Einstein wrote the president a letter. In the letter, he basically told Roosevelt that the Germans were developing an atomic bomb that would release energy and destruction beyond any other device ever devised by man. Roosevelt was finally convinced to start the development of the atomic bomb, but it took 2 years before Roosevelt actually agreed to start and expedite the work. The money was available from a secret government fund. 2 months later, the Japanese, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt released the money for the program. It was called the Manhattan Project. The project included a vast building program necessary to manufacture the bomb's ingredients. Pictured here are the 2 men in charge of that project. General Leslie Groves, 46-year-old West Pointer. He had just finished building the Pentagon, which at that time was the largest office building in the world. Next to him is Julius Robert Oppenheimer, a world-renowned physicist who had led the team of scientists that created the atomic bomb. The bomb itself, as you can see from this map, was developed across the entire United States. Groves proceeded with the formation of a huge industrial complex. 600,000 people worked on the bomb. The cost itself was approximately $2 billion, which would be $40 billion today. However, I must comment that the construction of airfields and bases in the South Pacific by the Seabees during World War II that helped to support all those invasions of all those islands cost more money than the Manhattan Project. The first atomic chain reaction occurred on December 2nd, 1943, when Enrico Fermi supervised a self-sustaining atomic pile at the squash court at the University of Chicago. There is a sculpture today on the campus of the university which talks about that for a successful first chain reaction. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a sprawling complex, you see here a picture of the women that were trying to pry the highly fissionable U-232 from the U-238, the predominant isotope in natural uranium. Roosevelt and Churchill in September of 1944 agreed to use the atomic bomb once it was finally ready. And they considered using it first against the Japanese. The first two bombs would be named in their honor, Fat Man for Churchill, and initially Thin Man, later called Little Boy, for Roosevelt. After the death of Roosevelt, only then did President Truman learn anything about the atomic bomb. In June of 1945, Truman asked the Assistant Secretary of War to add his comments about how to avoid invading Japan and having all those casualties. The secretary asked, why not use the atomic bomb? Well, the biggest issue was they didn't have an atomic bomb. They didn't even know if an atomic bomb would work. So Truman ordered instead the beginning of the transfer of troops from Europe and from the United States across the Pacific to prepare for the invasion of Hiroshima. Here is Los Alamos, the remote base located in New Mexico, where Oppenheimer tried to do the impossible and build the first working bomb. Los Alamos, they assembled a stellar team of the world's leading physicists to assemble the working parts of that bomb. Many had fled Europe because they were Jews, or they had fled Europe because of Nazi persecution. Think about this for a moment. If Hitler had not been anti-Semitic and the Germans had not been so ruthless in their repression of freedom, possibly some of those men would have stayed and the Germans might have built the first bomb. But luckily for us, that's not the way it worked. At the same time, however, a Soviet spy was one of the physicists from Europe, and he leaked all the plans that were developed at Los Alamos to the Russians. In 1949, using those plans, the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb, which was a copy of the one from Los Alamos. Once they had constructed the bomb, to test it, they moved it to a site called Trinity. The bomb itself, they called it the Gadget. As you see, it was a huge device. A tower was built at the test site to drop and detonate that bomb. On July 16, 1945, the test produced this result. This is how the Los Alamos scientists reacted to the explosion that day. Quote, it looked like a flickering bulb. The cloud reached the natural clouds in the dawning sky. The explosion came to our eyes and to our ears with a tremendous wind. The land was dark before, and now it was as bright, as strong, and as bright as the sun. Unquote. The scientists held their breath. They yelled, they screamed. They thought it was awful. They thought it was triumphant or beautiful or all of the above. Before the bomb was actually exploded, some of the physicists thought it would set off a chain reaction that would be uncontrollable and would rip away the atmosphere of the Earth and destroy us all. That didn't happen. The first bomb blast was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. A radius of 1 mile was vaporized. If dropped in the middle of Manhattan Island, the rubble would be as flat as a Kansas prairie. Today, you can visit in Las Vegas the Nevada Test Ground Museum and see films of that and the entire development of the bomb. And the docents are former biologists that worked at the nuclear test ground that was closed in the 80s. To produce that bomb, the scientists had compressed metals until the close proximity created a surplus of energy, and that energy made this monstrous explosion. From the splitting, the fission of uranium, they created Little Boy. And from the separating of a new element, plutonium, they made Fat Man. Soon thereafter, 2 bombs were built, Fat Man and Little Boy. 1 bomb per month could be manufactured afterward, one at a time, by the United States. The Enola Gay was used to drop the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Japan. Here were the members of the 393rd Bombardment Squadron, a section of the 509th. Lieutenant Colonel Tibbett was the pilot, and Enola Gay was named after his mother. Thin Man, or Little Boy, was a narrow uranium bomb weighing 5 tons. In fact, it weighed so much they had to strip the airplane of all of its armament so that the plane could take off. Here's the flight path that they followed to Hiroshima. August 6th, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. At an altitude of 1,870 feet, 9½ pounds of cordite drove the uranium chunks into each other, and a brilliant purplish white flash lit the sky. 4¼ miles of Hiroshima were flattened, 2/3 of the city destroyed, 59% of the buildings. Hiroshima had been a major harbor, crammed with oil refineries, workshops, warehouses, armament factories. All had vanished. The population of 343,000, a garrison of 150,000 troops. Over 78,000 died, another 70,000 seriously injured. Here is the equivalent of using conventional bombs. Little Boy equated to 20,000 tons of TNT. The explosion temperature was that of the sun. After Hiroshima, the Emperor and his cabinet considered what to do. The Potsdam Declaration by the Allies still demanded surrender of the Emperor. The Japanese rejected the ultimatum. Why? First, they didn't think that Hiroshima was an A-bomb. We didn't have an A-bomb. Second, the U.S. had no more A-bombs. Third, international opinion would stop the use of any A-bomb. Well, a few days later, on August the 9th, another A-bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, a port city. The day before, Russia had declared war on Japan. Japan had hoped to negotiate a separate peace with the Russians, which obviously did not happen. And now Nagasaki. Fat Man was a plutonium bomb, 10 feet, 8 inches long, never been tested before. The issue certainly was decided. They had enough plutonium to explode the bomb. 1.5 square miles of Nagasaki was flattened, 74% of the cities. The population of 250,000, 35,000 were killed, 60,000 injured. There's the result. The Emperor again met on August the 9th. The cabinet was divided. 3 agreed to surrender, 3 held out. By then, Truman had modified the demand, saying that he would promise to continue a constitutional monarchy under the President dynasty under Emperor Hirohito. At 2 a.m. in the morning, the Emperor spoke for the first time, breaking traditional silence. He would only usually speak through his chamberlain to the cabinet. He spoke directly to the cabinet and demanded immediate surrender. I swallow my tears and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation. In order that the people may know, I request you prepare at once an imperial order that I will broadcast to the nation. This, of course, was unprecedented, since the Japanese considered Hirohito a god and they had never heard his voice before. Though the Emperor was right, he was in grave danger of an army coup. Rebellion was at hand. The younger army zealots in the Japanese military district of Tokyo did not care about the atomic bomb. Surrender was a worse fate than death. The Japanese had never lost a war. On August 9th, 1945, at 7:33 a.m., the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo announced through a code to Switzerland and Sweden that they would agree to surrender. The US and China and the UK accepted the surrender. However, 5 days later, on August the 14th, troops of the Imperial Japanese Army invaded the palace of the emperor to kidnap the emperor and smash the recording he had made, a record that would be used the next day for the surrender. They did not find the emperor. He was well hidden by his colleagues, and they did not find the recording. They failed. Here are the coup leaders who failed in this attempt. The principal reason in the end why it failed is that General Tanaka, who was the commander of the Tokyo military district, came to the palace early in the morning and ordered the troops out. He then went back to his headquarters and killed himself. The next day, at 12 noon, the people of Japan listened to the imperial receipt terminating the war. Hirohito's decision was dramatic and unprecedented and was designed to forestall any further attempt by right-wing fanatics in the military to continue the war. Hirohito told his stunned people, should we continue to fight, not only would it result in ultimate obliteration of the Japanese nation, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. However, it is according to these dictates of time and fate that we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. There he is reading the speech. September 2nd, VJ Day. Japan's imperial dreams of an empire across Asia. There's the graveyard of the part of the fleet in Tokyo Bay. 260 Allied ships steamed into Tokyo Bay, and there on the battleship Missouri, in that bay, the final surrender was made. General MacArthur presided. The gentleman in the top hat had been the prime minister in the 1930s who wanted peace. They attempted to assassinate him, and he was thrown out of office. He had a wooden leg. He had to struggle up the side of the ship. It is ironic that they sent him, the man who did not want the war, to sign the surrender, because no one else would do it. He agreed. MacArthur signed. General Wainwright, who was surrendered at Bataan. General Percival, who had been at the surrender at Singapore, the largest surrender in British history of 70,000, also signed. The Japanese then made their signature. This was a mess table taken from the captain's cabin, the admiral's cabin. They used the surrender papers to cover up the coffee stains on the felt cloth that covered the table. If you go today to Pearl Harbor and you go to see the Arizona, you will see the Missouri several hundred feet away. It's parked there, moored there. Go there. You can tour it. You can see the exact spot and the plaque where the Japanese surrendered. The Japanese saw hundreds and hundreds of aircraft flying over Tokyo Bay. One of the officers wondered how Japan could ever have thought to have defeated this mighty power. On August 15th, senior Japanese officers overseas still refused to surrender. On August 17th, the emperor made a second broadcast ordering them to surrender. Across Japan and Asia, thousands of Allied POWs who would have been murdered were at last freed. But well aware of the fanatics in the Japanese military, two separate members of the imperial family were dispatched across Asia to garrisons to force those officers to comply with the emperor's wishes. Here is an unprecedented photo of the Emperor of Japan meeting with a commoner. This had never occurred before, MacArthur. He met with MacArthur and said to him, quote, "I come to you, General MacArthur, to offer myself to the judgment of the powers you represent as the one to bear sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and action taken by my people in the conduct of the war." He didn't want his people to suffer. He wanted to offer himself up instead. There were 10 further meetings between MacArthur and the emperor before MacArthur would leave. But Japan's reconstruction into a constitutional democracy began, offering liberal civil rights, freedom of speech, academic freedom, equality of the sexes, political parties, a parliamentary form of government. Japan became a major economic power again, one of the world's strongest economies. Well, let us now talk about the atomic bomb debate. A careful study of Japan's decision to surrender notes the alternatives to using the A-bomb. Could we have merely attempted to force the Japanese to surrender by famine and by further bombing? Russians were about to invade northern Japan. In the mainland of Asia, they had invaded Manchuria. 2.7 million Japanese nationals. Of this, 340 to 370,000 of the Japanese died at the hands of the Soviets. Taking this as a yardstick, the human cost of Japanese occupation of Hokkaido, about another 400,000 Japanese non-combatants potentially would have died. The notion that continued use of conventional air and sea power by itself, without an invasion or use of the atomic weapon, has never been proved or disproved conclusively. Yet, it is hard to see how a long continuing aerial bombardment of Japan would have led to the Japanese military to surrender. It is unclear that without the using of the bomb, the emperor would have actually intervened to provide the essential step to force the Japanese military to surrender. And without an organized capitulation, it is not clear whether the final war would have ended in 1 month, 1 year, or 2 more years. As we have seen with Hirohito's support, 2 bomb attacks, the Japanese almost succeeded with a military coup in scuttling the peace through the palace coup. The atomic bomb, which ended the war against Japan, did not cause as much material damage nor as many casualties as all the incendiary bombings across Japan. Tokyo alone, 130,000 people had died. The other air raids had caused over 300,000 Japanese deaths. All Allied prisoners of war held by the Japanese would have been murdered in cold blood the moment the invasion started. Arrangements for these massacres had been made in minute detail. Many of them would have been burnt alive in places throughout Japan. There was no escape. The rest would have been finished off with the machine guns. The other perspective, the infantrymen and Marines in the U.S. Army and Navy preparing for the assault, the sailors who would have to undergo weeks of kamikaze attacks off the mainland. I can tell you now, in interviewing men over the years about this, they were overjoyed when they heard that Japanese had surrendered and they would not have to invade Japan. If the U.S. had invaded Japan, the operation would have been a long and protracted effort. It probably would have been extended at least into 46, possibly 47. The American public was very anxious to have the Second World end and have their sons and daughters and sweethearts returned. General MacArthur, the Army Chief of Staff, made this remark: "The American people don't want to fight a 7 years war." And of course, the Soviets had declared war only at the very end of the war so that they could possibly end by occupying parts of Japan. So then we could have had a communist North and a free South. Maybe a Berlin Wall in Tokyo, like in Berlin. The people of Japan would have suffered for decades like the people of East Germany and North Korea. By surrendering when they did, the Japanese saved the lives of many of their citizens and soldiers who would have been killed had they fought to the bitter end. Operation Downfall, as we said, the results would have been horrendous slaughter on both sides. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, said that the resort to nuclear weapons represented the least abhorrent choice before the American leaders to end the war. The atomic bomb was awful, but the alternatives were much worse. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. scrapped plans to issue a commemorative stamp on the use of the A-bombs to end the Second World War, simply because the bombs itself were something that the United States never wanted to use again. Since then, more than 2,500 nuclear explosions have occurred. There are 15,000 nuclear warheads across the world today. This is the lesson of history that we must daily ponder. Our civilization hangs on the slender thread of mutually assured destruction. That awesome fear has kept the nuclear genie in the bottle and prevented the gross immorality of a totally devastating nuclear war. Our daily vigilance must remain strong to prevent a nuclear catastrophe that would end civilization as we would know it. Throughout the Second World War, area-wide bombing, the use of firebombing, murdered more civilians in the Second World War than military. 50 million people died in the Second World War. War is immoral. The United States fought a defensive war. It certainly responded to an attack. The Europeans fought a defensive war against Nazi aggression. So in final analysis, all the bombing was immoral. The wars were immoral. War is legalized murder. The atomic bomb itself would annihilate civilization if it is used again, if it results in a total nuclear catastrophe. So I end today with the hope and prayer that we never will see another mushroom cloud over any city in the world, because it would mean the end of human existence. Thank you very much.